Hello, Dr. David Thunder. Thank you so much for speaking with me today. Could you tell the viewers a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure, it's great to be here. I'm a researcher and lecturer in political philosophy at the University of Navarra's Institute for Culture and Society, which is a social science research institute affiliated to the University of Navarra in Pamplona, Spain. I'm currently on a research visit at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. My research area is basically constitutional democracy, self-government, and issues to do with citizenship, civil rights,
Right.
and civic engagement. And I'm particularly interested in the question of decentralized government and local government.
Yes.
So I'm an advocate of federalism, which basically means a kind of dispersed governance and dispersed political power across a territory in which local actors have an important role to play, and in which power is not heavily concentrated in one point.
Mm-hmm. So given these past 2 years, how would you say that landscape has changed?
I would say that most states nowadays are in fact already quite centralized, and were already quite centralized national states. And of course, the United States is an example of a federal system in which the individual states have quite a lot of power. And so it's not a completely centralized system. But what I've seen is that the centralizing trends have been accentuated during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Because usually in times of perceived emergencies, such as a war or an epidemic, people are more willing to surrender power to a central actor. And that's what's happened, in fact, often under emergency power legislation. So power has been heavily centralized during the pandemic under the, I would say, false notion that a health crisis can best be managed by a centralized actor. And I think that the events of the past 2 years have shown the abysmal failure of centralized actors at tackling the pandemic. And the reason for the failures of centralized government, one of the reasons is simply because they're not able to fully understand the conditions that are occurring on the ground in different localities. And those conditions vary dramatically depending on the context. For example, it's very different to deal with a pandemic in the middle of a nursing home with people whose average age might be over 70, to say dealing with a pandemic in the context of a school in which people's average age is under 18.
Right.
So you know, those kinds of important differences, as well as geographic and territorial differences, simply are not really taken into account by massive kind of large-scale cookie cutter policies.
Yes.
So I think that centralized government has really let us down, and we have not tapped the resources of local actors properly in this pandemic.
You talk about the failures of centralized government. Would you say that lockdown is a prime example of that?
Yes. I mean, I think it's possible to implement effective centralized policies, intelligent and focused policies that come down from the top, especially when they're done in a way that consults local actors and that tries to get local buy-in and consensus, a maximum consensus. But lockdowns are perhaps the worst type of centralized policy that you can imagine, because first of all, because they are highly coercive and do not, in fact, are not based on consultation. They're not based on consulting the needs and interests of local actors, or indeed their insights. And secondly, they're not based on evidence.
Right.
So it's not evidence-based policymaking. It's policymaking based on the hunches of some centralized policymakers.
Or the
who are
modeling predictions of
yeah, exactly, the mathematical predictions
yeah.
that are based on data that is completely underpowered by empirical research. A mathematical model, as many people say, is only as good as the data that feeds into it.
Yes.
So one of the errors of these mathematical models was that they simply disregarded or vastly underestimated the importance of natural immunity in the population.
I wanted to discuss a little bit with you the vaccine mandates, and obviously get your opinion. And if you could give me a bit of insight, you wrote a recent on your blog an open letter to President Macron of France. What led you to write that open letter?
President Macron had an interview with a magazine called Le Parisien, and in that interview, he expressed frustration towards the unvaccinated. And one of the things he said was that he wanted to F up the life of the unvaccinated, piss them off, make their life kind of hell, basically.
Yeah.
And also to limit their access, to go as far as he could, jusqu'au bout, which means right to the very end, in limiting their access to social life.
Yes.
So essentially, he was advocating a kind of aggressive medical apartheid,
yes,
in which you would make the people who were not vaccinated with COVID vaccines make their life as unpleasant as possible, to pressure them and coerce them and cajole them into accepting the vaccine. And
it would be a lockdown of the unvaccinated, which is the path that Austria chose to go down.
Yes. I mean, whatever we want to call it, it's basically excluding the unvaccinated from social life and from the public arena.
Right.
It's a vile form of discrimination, and it really, to me, it was shocking to me to hear him say these things about his fellow citizens. These are people who probably some of them elected him to office, and whether they elected him or not is not the point. He's representing them as the president of the French Republic, and you can't treat citizens in this way as if they're criminals, right, because they make a medical choice that you disapprove of or you don't agree with.
Yeah. I mean, you didn't mince your words. I'm going to read a little bit, just a quote from what you wrote. You said in the open letter to Macron, you stated, "You are a disgrace to the office you hold and bring shame to the French Republic. Instead of uniting citizens under the same flag, you are inciting hateful and sectarian attitudes, treating citizens as enemies of the state because they assess the benefits of a vaccine differently to you." Could you explain? I mean, those are quite harsh words. How can you justify what you wrote?
Well, basically, one of the bedrock principles of a modern democratic republic is equality before the law. All citizens have an equal dignity, equal standing before the law, and they have an equal right to participate in the social life of a democratic society. They have an equal right to go to a restaurant in general. Of course, there are certain rules of etiquette that can exclude people, like if you go to a black tie event or something, they're not going to accept if you're wearing a T-shirt. Right. But it is fundamental to a democratic society that we don't actively exclude people from social life because of their private health choices, because of the way they manage their own health choices, and according to their own criteria and their own prudence, their own prudent and informed judgment. And what Macron has done is essentially he's advocated for a form of collectivism that is completely against the ethos of liberal democracy. Right. Collectivism, by collectivism, I basically mean that someone on the top mandates for everyone how they should live their life, what health choices they should make, which medications they should take even. To me, this is so anathema to what any modern democracy represents. to the values of a democracy, representative democracy, constitutional democracy, that I do believe it brings shame on the French Republic that their leader would advocate these kinds of draconian measures. And it's the thin edge of a wedge, because once you start to essentially downgrade the citizenship of a certain group of citizens, if you treat them as third-class citizens, second-class citizens, what you do is you introduce a really dangerous precedent.
Yes.
And today it might be for their vaccination status. Tomorrow it might be because they're obese and therefore they're more of a burden on the health system. The next day it might be because in their social media they said something that wasn't politically correct. Therefore they're stripped of their citizenship effectively. It's a really dangerous and dark path that he's taking the French down in these statements. A really basic principle as well concerning public health, which we've respected up to now, is that health decisions are actually very personal matters, not just because we respect people's liberty, but because health is something that varies across different people. People have different health conditions.
Yes.
And so it's a very intimate choice that has to be adapted to your individual condition.
Yes.
So just as an example, who are the people who actually end up in hospital with COVID? The vast majority are people who have underlying health problems. And according to a recent study posted on the CDC website, for example, 94.9% of all COVID hospitalizations across a group of about 500,000 that they studied were people who had at least one underlying health problem. And so a young person, say, a young person with no serious health condition is extremely, extremely unlikely to end up in a hospital with COVID-19. And it's just so disingenuous to suggest that, for example, a 35 or 40-year-old with no serious health condition who is unvaccinated is a burden on the health system. Yes. That is simply false. It's simply false, and it's just pure propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, would you classify it as disinformation, a deliberate?
It's disinformation because what it does is it takes a general statistic and then it applies it to every sector of the population. Let's assume, if that's the case, it seems to be the case, that at least in certain demographics, in certain cohorts, there are more unvaccinated people being admitted with COVID-19 proportionately than vaccinated people. So it's possible that the vaccine provides some protection in certain cohorts of the population. But what people have done is, including governments and including scientists, is they've taken this very general statistic and they've insinuated that it applies to every cohort, every single part of the population, including young and healthy people. Yeah. And so to turn to someone in the street who is walking down the street and is 30 years old and is in perfectly good health, and to suggest that that person is a burden on the health system because they're not taking this vaccine is a lie. It's a downright lie. There's no question but that there has been a lack of, as I said, transparency and clarity, and certainly the way in which data has been reported by governments has been clearly biased towards fear-mongering.
Right.
And a clear example of that is the incessant reporting of PCR data.
Yes.
And let's be very clear about this. PCR cases are not cases at all. A case has been understood in medicine as a person who is suffering from some disease. And we have to have evidence that that person is suffering from the disease and has been infected with the disease. That's a case, right? But what governments have done is they've ramped up this massive number of so-called cases, which are PCR positive tests. But we know that PCR positive tests do not correspond to real clinical cases because they're simply a lab test that may or may not correspond to a symptomatic case or a real case of disease. And so they're basically just numbers that you reel off, and they're meaningless. Yeah. And we needed to know how many people had the disease, not how many people tested positive. Many people who show up with positive PCR tests never even develop symptoms. If you don't have symptoms of disease, you're not sick. If you don't develop symptoms of a disease at any point, you're not sick. And so I think we've turned the common sense of doctors on its head. Best practice of doctors has been turned on its head with these very strange practices, which we never did in the case of flus, for example, or past epidemics.
Yes.
And it really has distorted the public understanding of the disease and of its severity, of its extent, because people hear a number like, say, 100,000 cases, and they have no idea how many of those cases involve sickness, how many of those are actual cases. So it's a really egregious abuse of statistics and of lab data. I sincerely hope people answer for this abuse that has occurred over the past 2 years.
I would like to talk a little bit about your sort of end of last year, you were deplatformed from Twitter. I know you've been very vocal arguing against lockdowns, mask mandates. What do you think led to you essentially being censored on Twitter and your account permanently suspended?
Well, I can only guess, because Twitter is notorious for not explaining their suspensions. So nobody really knows for sure exactly why they suspend an account, simply because they never give any detailed explanation of their decisions. However, you can infer from looking at the history of flags, so on the account, what their motives might be. So they flagged a number of my tweets over the past year. And I've noticed a pattern in the types of tweets that they've been flagging. One is that if they question any aspect whatsoever of the vaccination campaign,
right,
even if they're favorable to the vaccine in general, if they question any aspect of that campaign, they're susceptible to being flagged. So I had a few tweets in which I mentioned the issue of the fact that younger people are less at risk from COVID-19,
right,
and therefore that the net benefit of the vaccine is not as decisive or as obvious in the case of a young, healthy person as an older person. So that was an example of the type of tweet was being flagged. And another type of issue that they flag all the time is anyone who mentions ivermectin.
Yes, I was going to say that because I was going to read your tweet.
Yeah, with a positive resonance to the message. According to them, the reason that they suspended me was because of what they called repeat violations.
Right.
So that means that it couldn't have been, according to their own logic, it couldn't have been just that tweet that got me kicked off the platform. It had to be the pattern of violating their rules, which they seem to pretty much make up as they go along, and they seem to not answer for. They never explain why, how you violated the rule exactly, or which part of your tweet violated the rule, because one tweet can have more than one statement in it. So they never specify exactly which statements violate the rule. But clearly, yes, it would be the reference to the fact that ivermectin is being used to treat COVID in many countries.
Yeah. Now, where can people find you on?
Well, my main website is davidthunder.com, and all of my social media channels can be found on the homepage there of davidthunder.com. They can also find me on davidthunder.substack.com.
I believe you're also on Getter as well. What are your views on Getter?
Yeah. So
Twitter.
Yeah, I opened an account on Getter a few weeks ago, and basically my view on Getter is that even though there's no guarantee that it will remain free and free-spirited, because it is a private company and they have the discretion and choice to do what they want, pretty much just as Twitter has. But for the time being, at least, they seem to be a lot more permissive and tolerant than Twitter. and they seem to allow a wider diversity of perspectives. So I'm kind of reserving judgment in the long run, because we don't know what's going to happen. Right. It's only been around since July, I think.
Yes.
But a lot of people, high profile figures, have gone on there, like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson,
Dr. Robert Malone,
and Robert Malone, and a lot of people I had been following on Twitter myself and learned a lot from, such as Ivor Cummins, have gone on to get her as well. So I'd like to get on that train and see where it leads me. And I'll quite happily hop off if it turns out that they're not going to be respecting people's freedom. According to expert analysis that I have reviewed by different epidemiologists and virologists, it looks very much like Omicron is a really important step towards the end of the pandemic, or towards what some people call an endemic condition, or endemicity. So to basically endemic, the virus becomes endemic when it's in wide circulation, but it's not really doing a lot of damage in general. In other words, it's a kind of a peaceful coexistence with the virus. So it lives in the population, so to speak. It moves around in the population. It circulates, but it doesn't cause a massive spike in deaths or hospitalizations or illness. It's equivalent to basically a flu or a cold, right? That would be the end point of an endemic kind of virus. And this is the closest. This brings us much closer to that endemic phase of the virus. We're entering an endemic phase, which basically spells the end of the pandemic in principle. And it's only a question of months, from what I've been reading. It's a question of months before this pandemic should be over, and it'll be over in Europe at a different time, perhaps earlier than in the United States. But we're on the way out from it, and this is good news on so many fronts, because not just because we're going to have, let's say, less COVID-related illness and disease and hospitalization and death, but also because governments will now be stripped of the excuse that they've been using for so long to strip citizens of their civil rights, and to lock down populations, and to close businesses, and to keep children away from their education. These excuses are running out. I don't know what the next excuse they'll come up with, whether they'll say they want to prevent another outbreak. Perhaps they'll use a prevention kind of discourse. But I think that's a very positive development on the civil rights front, that this excuse will be much weaker now rhetorically. It's much harder to make use of this kind of excuse when we see that objectively COVID is having such a lower impact. I'm not saying we're out of it completely, because of course hospitalizations are continuing, and even in some places at least moderately increasing. But the long-term kind of view is positive. Is very we can be optimistic about this. What's most alarming is that my impression is that there's an effort to railroad through the vaccine, even coercively, by harassing and pestering and badgering people who decline it. Yes. Which I think is disgraceful, and I think that especially for any medicine that would be disgraceful, but especially for a vaccine that whose long-term risks, by definition, are still unknown, because it's only been around for about a year or so. So I think it's really important for people to understand that even if the initial preliminary trials by the vaccine companies seemed to show positive results, those numbers were not sufficiently large for us to get an adequate picture of their population-wide impact. And also that they do not preserve their control group of unvaccinated beyond about 6 months. That's what I've understood, at least. Some of the effects of a vaccine can show up, maybe months or years after the vaccine itself has been administered.
Yeah.
So basically, we need to kind of be patient and see what happens at the level of population-wide level over the long run. And it's totally unethical in the meantime to railroad people into taking the vaccine against their will.
Yes.
We need to have full transparency and full disclosure about something that is literally a matter of life and death. I mean, a medication that we know has adverse side effects. We need to know what the extent of the side effects are, how serious they are, and also especially how frequent they are in the population. And so that requires full disclosure of data, and it requires good collecting of data on side effects. And I know Dr. Robert Malone has been, who himself was intimately involved in the development of mRNA technology, and so is definitely as an expert, if anyone is, on the topic of vaccines. And he has been critical of the way in which side effects have been reported and collected. So he basically says it's too haphazard, it's not systematic enough, and there isn't enough staffing and resources in the FDA and in relevant reporting organizations to be able to really get a proper full picture. And so like, it's not like we're asking for something controversial. We're asking for transparency and full disclosure. That's all we're asking for. And there's been, I believe there's been quite a bit of obfuscation and evasion about the vaccines, about hospitalizations. Some of the hospitalization data, for example, very often does not indicate clearly how many unvaccinated people had underlying conditions. So that's a simple piece of information that is highly relevant for risk management that we don't see coming out of hospitalization reports that I've seen, or you have to dig very hard probably to be able to find that data.
Yeah. Do you think there is it's justifiable, the level of sort of public mistrust in their governments now, given that they've been lied to for so long?
Well, I guess it would be interesting to quantify how much public distrust there is. It's interesting to me to note that there was apparently a relatively high level of compliance with lockdown orders, and opinion polls showed a large majority of people even demanding more lockdowns. So on one hand, I'd say a lot of people seem to be very naive and gullible and over-trusting in that they trust public authorities with their lives and with their livelihoods too much. But I don't have data to back this up or to prove it. But it wouldn't surprise me if there was a growing minority of people who are becoming distrustful or suspicious towards their governments. And if they were, they'd be right to do so. Because in my opinion, governments have forfeited the right of citizens to trust them in anything concerning public health, basically, at this time, the management of any kind of public health crisis. And it's not as if this is new, completely new, because we know, of course, that many Western countries have chronic problems in the public health systems, in their healthcare services, that have not been addressed for many, many years. And what happened with COVID is that those problems came to a boiling point. And so the hospitals were already under-resourced and badly managed for winter peaks, and we had a big winter peak that was over the normal peak. And so hospitals entered into crisis mode. But they were simply not properly prepared for this situation, and they had years to prepare for it, because they knew that governments knew that there was a public health crisis for years, and they didn't do anything about it. And so now they have they're actually blaming unvaccinated people for the failure of their health system.
Right.
And I find that to be just, just incredible.
It is. Many incredible things have happened over these past 2 years. And David, just thank you so much for your time today. If there's anything else you want to add, feel free.
One of the major issues of the past 2 years is misinformation by official sources, such as governments. Misinformation or distorted information or biased information or fear-mongering. And so I really encourage people to look for sources, reliable sources, whether it be academics, scientists, scholars, or independent journalists, who are not just responding to advertising pressures or editorial agendas. Look for them, seek them out, follow them. I try to provide balanced information, informed analysis. So I just encourage you to look for independent journalists and commentators who can, provide you with a more independent perspective so that you're not enslaved to propaganda.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, David, for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.